Well, I think maybe we're ready to get started. My name is Hannah, and I'm discussant for today. And joining us in this program are our participants. Our presenters, Natalie Hadley, who's Vice President with Outlook Business Solutions, and Ken Nakata, Principal with Converge Accessibility, to discuss why DEI programs need to begin with accessibility. So we'll go ahead and jump in. Any questions you have, you may post in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Hannah. And thanks, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation describing why DEI programs should start with accessibility. So while I was giving a keynote at this year's Digital Accessibility Legal Summit in Washington, D.C., I floated the idea of why DEI and DEIA programs need to start with accessibility first and foremost. Some of the attendees told me over LinkedIn afterwards that they really liked that idea, but being a keynote, I was only touching on this idea at a very high abstract level. So after that presentation, I was talking about this idea with my friend Natalie Hadley, and we both thought it would be a great addition to PACRIM. So I presented several years now at PACRIM. This is really a unique conference, not just because of its awesome physical location, which I really wish I were at right now, but also because it combines perspectives from the disability perspective, diversity, academia, and also a community activism edge. And that's together exactly the right kind of audience to have this discussion. So Natalie and I both think that starting with the DEI discussion from the accessibility perspective makes sense. We think it fits in with how humans likely perceive different people, as well as the practical perspective of giving DEI programs clearer key performance indicators and metrics so their programs can show quantifiable progress. But before we get into that, we should probably introduce ourselves.
Hello, everybody. I'm Natalie Hadley, and I'll be presenting this session with my friend Ken. I am the Vice President of Outlook Business Solutions. We are a marketing and digital accessibility agency that exists to create earning opportunities for knowledge-based workers who happen to be visually impaired. My role in the organization is marketing strategist and business development. We're a social enterprise that helps organizations recognize the value of accessibility in their consumer and their employee-facing marketing. On a personal note, I am the mother of a 26-year-old son who suffered a traumatic brain injury at 3 months of age. And as a result, he has intellectual and developmental disabilities along with physical impairments. So I will let Ken introduce himself.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. So my name is Ken Nakata. I used to be a senior trial attorney in the Disability Rights section at the U.S. Department of Justice. And during my 12 years at Justice, I investigated and litigated dozens of cases under the ADA, such as practices that limited opportunities for people with mental illness or who had sought mental health counseling. I also negotiated a nationwide settlement agreement with Greyhound bus lines to provide accessible bus service over a year before they were required to, and that led Greyhound to become a leader in their industry and that provided accessible transportation service to over 3,500 passengers across America. I was also the lead attorney in the federal government's Section 508 working group, which made all of the federal government's IT systems accessible. I also wrote the Justice Department's policies and technical assistance on what state and local government agencies need to do to make their websites accessible. But I also spent a one-year detail to the special litigation section. I did something a little different there. And there I organized a team of attorneys and investigated, litigated, and settled the Justice Department's first consent decree of police misconduct by a major metropolitan police force. That case, which required working alongside the NAACP and the ACLU, ultimately became a model for similar efforts by the Justice Department for investigating police forces nationwide. Since leading the Justice Department, I've been involved in hundreds of projects involving digital accessibility and have advised dozens of attorneys and law firms around the country around digital accessibility. I was also selected by NASA as their lead consultant to help ensure that educational STEM programs funded by NASA are accessible to tomorrow's generation of scientists, doctors, and mathematicians with disabilities.
Awesome. Thanks, Ken. So as Ken and I discussed this topic, I started to do some research on the development of bias in children. I am not a child psychologist, but as I read some of the available research on this topic, I started to see some connections and formulate some hypotheses, if you will. And today I'd like to lay out some of those ideas. And then in our question period at the end of the session, Ken and I would like to hear from you about your thoughts on this topic. So to start with some of the basics, our brains want to sort people and things into group. This allows our brains to quickly process large amounts of information, and much of that processing happens unconsciously. Unconscious processing happens 200,000 times faster than conscious processing. So if we had to consciously sort that amount of information, we would quickly become overwhelmed and incapacitated. And we might look sort of like this cartoon cat. We'd either freak out or we'd become catatonic, pun intended. So where this starts is from a child's first steps. Parents and family members and society are celebrating their abilities. We create a baby book to track milestones like rolling over, standing up, first steps, and first words. And as we do that, we heap praise on our children about acquiring those abilities. And in the research I reviewed, and you'll find a list of sources at the end of the PowerPoint deck, the research showed that children start sorting people by similarities by 6 months of age and possibly even earlier, and that children become aware of gender, race, ethnicity, and ability differences between the ages of 2 and 5. So awareness of ability or disability may start earlier and become more ingrained than awareness of other differences because of the value our parents and society places on the ability at an early age. So while our baby brains are developing the ability to observe similarities and group things together, we're also developing our own sense of self-awareness and self-esteem. And we start to recognize that we are separate beings from our parents, but we're also noticing similarities. And observing similarities to ourselves reinforces our sense of belonging, and belonging feels good. And when we observe dissimilarities in ourselves, it may create a sense of otherness or isolation from the group, and not belonging can maybe feel bad or be perceived as bad. So as we are organizing information by similarities, we're seeking affirmation that the way we're organizing it is supported by the world around us. We're making assumptions, we're drawing conclusions, and then we're testing those on the people around us. An example would be, you know what, I'm going to scoot back for 1 second. I wanted to give an example on the side of my son when he was injured. He went to a special needs daycare, and his sister went to a daycare for typical children. And one day I took my son in with me when I was picking my daughter up. And at that time he was wearing an eye patch over one eye to try to strengthen the other eye. And there were 2 little girls about 4 years old who saw him. And the one said to the other, "Did you see that baby's eye? That's gross." And I remember that word gross so specifically because it seemed like such a strong reaction to what was basically a Band-Aid over his eye. And so I gently but firmly explained that it wasn't gross, that his eye was hurt and the patch was making it better. So challenging our brain's categorization choices like perceiving an eye patch or any otherness as gross happens as the brain develops judgment. So children at that age cannot apply their judgment in curtailing those comments, right? We talk about children always speak truth, but they don't have that higher cognitive level of organizing information, and that doesn't fully develop, that judgment doesn't fully develop until we're in our early 20s. So again, we're sorting information, we're making assumptions. Another example with my 2 oldest children was when they were 6 and 4. And my son was in a wheelchair at that time, and I had taken the kids to Subway for dinner. And out of the blue, my 6-year-old daughter asked if she fell out of the crib as a baby. And I confessed that she had when she was about 1.5 years old. I left the crib rail down. She was standing in the crib, and she flipped over the side. And then she stated, "Rain fell out of the crib too." That's my son's name is Rain. And I told her, no, he hadn't. And she kind of argued with me, and she responded, "Yes, he did. That's why his brain doesn't work right. So here this 6-year-old, 5 to 6-year-old had been puzzling this out in her brain, why her brain worked right and her brother's didn't. So she was already noticing the disability. And I had to tell her the truth, that her brother had been shaken by a daycare provider, and that was what had hurt his brain. Adults may unknowingly reinforce assumptions children are making about how they've organized similarities, even if those assumptions are false. So the slide here is an example. We've got a row of girls' bikes, and we know that they're girls' bikes because they're missing that, oh, Ken, I forgot the word.
It's top rod.
Top tube. I know it was something like that. So it's missing the top tube. And Ken was enlightening me, he's a cyclist, that the original design for a girls, quote unquote, girls bike was to accommodate women riding with skirts. And so we've got a row of the quote unquote girls bike design, and all of the bikes are pink. So a child may make the assumption of, I'm a girl and I'm being told these bicycles are made for girls and all the bicycles are pink. So that must mean that all girls ride pink bikes. Now we know that girls can ride whatever color bikes they want. They can also ride boys' bikes. They don't have to ride the girls' models. But children are constantly making those assumptions and drawing those conclusions. And those things get reinforced in movies, television, music, books, their home life, their social experiences, their interpersonal experiences. They are constantly categorizing the world around them by similarities and creating a framework for processing future information. So observing things or people that don't fit our sorting structure requires greater thought, and it challenges the structure that we've built. So we've probably all seen or heard of videos where you have a baby whose father has a beard, and the baby is completely accustomed to seeing this man with a beard and being held by this man with a beard. And one day dad decides he's going to shave the beard, and the baby freaks out. She has no idea who this guy is. And it's the same person. He just doesn't have the beard anymore. But she has come to associate that beard with that father figure, with that caring and with that feeling. So doubts about our sorting structure may lead to doubts about our perceptions of ourselves. And those challenges sometimes can come from other people. For example, if in a case of a mixed race adoption, someone may point out to a child that the child's skin color is different from his parents' skin color. And that may cause the child to start to wonder why the skin colors are different and to make assumptions about, well, I associate goodness with my parents. Is there something bad about me that my skin is a different color? So we may transfer that feeling of different or bad to things that cause the challenge to the structure that we've built. So think about conversations with children you've had or observed about race, gender, ethnic, or sexual identity differences. And in those conversations, we often focus on similarities. So if a child notices that another child has a different skin color, we may say, yes, but he has 2 arms and 2 legs, et cetera, just like you do. And with gender, we may focus on, well, both girls and boys can play soccer. Even sexual identity, if a child notices that her friend's parent has 2 mommies and she has a mommy and a daddy, we can say, well, but all love is good, right? So we're always looking at the similarities and pointing out the similarities. With disability, however, we're intrinsically talking about what is different. So when we talk about a child or someone who has a vision disability, we may say, well, she can't see a printed book, but she can feel a Braille book. Or mobility, he can't use his legs, but he uses a wheelchair. Or hearing, she can't hear your voice, so she watches your mouth to understand what you're saying. And we have done this in our family for years with our son, explaining to children and to other people how he does things and that he does them differently. So for a child, these alternate ways of doing things may be difficult to imagine or understand. They haven't fully developed that empathy that kind of lets them put themselves in someone else's shoes. So grasping that concept of disability may cause the child uncomfortable feelings or thought as they process those differences. And they may start to kind of make those leaps of logic. So, well, if I was in a wheelchair, I wouldn't be able to play basketball, and daddy is my basketball coach. So then maybe daddy wouldn't like me as much because I can't play basketball. Or if I couldn't see, I couldn't read. And people who can't read are babies or they're dumb. Or no one in my family is fill in the blank, blind, deaf, in a wheelchair. This just isn't part of who we are. And those thoughts or feelings may challenge that child's sense of self-esteem. In other words, kind of, I would be less if I couldn't do X. So research has shown that positive interactions with and exposure to differences actually reduces our anxiety about them. When we reduce our shock and discomfort with differences, we can focus on similarities that go beyond just physical attributes. And if we help people overcome one of their biggest unconscious biases, which is disability, we pave the way for changing their less strongly held biases. But we need the physical and digital worlds to be more accessible and inclusive of people with disabilities so we can increase the number of those interactions and that familiarity and understanding and reduce the anxiety that some people have when they encounter a person with disabilities. In the academic and business environments, we often see a focus on avoiding conflict over differences rather than embracing and celebrating them. So I had a friend who worked at a small college, and the college actually limited the number of sort of decorations for your preferred winter holiday that you could have on your cubicle. So they had a limit, like it was 3 or 5 or whatever of things that, you know, if you celebrated Christmas that you could have on your desk, or if you celebrate Hanukkah that you could have on your desk. And I thought that was so crazy because why would we not encourage those decorations and those expressions of our preferred winter holiday, and then have discussion and respectful learning about other religions, other cultures, and other traditions. Employee resource groups or business resource groups have become an outgrowth of the DEI movement. And the definition I found a really good one about business resource groups. And it said they are groups of employees who come together with common interests, perspectives, and experiences around topics such as ethnicity, gender identity, age, accessibility, and special interests. And I think that's great. I have benefited myself from support groups or mentoring groups that were specific to women in business. But how are we managing these groups in terms of intersectionality? Are we making attempts to cross-pollinate these groups so they can better stand each other's lived experiences? Are we inviting people who are outside the group to come in and hear about those lived experiences? So while I think the groups are great and supportive and people can definitely share challenges as well as share solutions, I think we need to be looking at how we cross-pollinate those groups and where we have intersectionality. And when there is a misunderstanding or a misstep around a DEI topic, so somebody says something that they probably don't know is offensive, are we training the recipient of that comment, how to make that a teachable moment, how to increase understanding, kind of like the holiday decorations? Are we emphasizing respect and kindness? Are we training people how to respond with respect and kindness and not immediately assume ill intent? Because I think a lot of times these things happen and people just don't even realize that they've insulted someone or they've made an offensive comment. So rather than, jumping immediately to being offended and defensive, let's have a conversation about why. Why was that offensive? And what should that person have said instead? Or what assumption did they make that was inaccurate? So in some ways, disability is really the most extreme type of difference, we can imagine. So when we're looking at the digital environment, we're looking at building a website or even a built environment, if we start with these questions, will this work for someone who is blind, is low vision, is colorblind, is hard of hearing, is deaf, can't use their hands, can't use their voice, can't use their legs, or thinks differently? If we start there, then our next level can go to, will it work for someone who doesn't have a smartphone, for someone who doesn't have internet access, for someone who doesn't have a car, who can't read, or who maybe doesn't speak English or the local language? And when we can have those conversations, then we can really look at what assumptions are we making? Does our choice of words assume a certain lived experience, like a perfect suburban childhood with a big yard and a quiet street and dad taught me how to ride a bike? Do our images reflect our audience? So is the audience able to see themselves in the images we're projecting? Are we scheduling events that conflict with major holidays of all religions? I think in the US, we have a tendency to look at major Christian and Jewish holidays, but we don't always stop to think about there are other, I think there's something like 14 religions that celebrate different holidays during the winter season. So are we accommodating all of those? So I love this next slide, and I'll do audio description here. So are we using stereotypes, which is grandma wears an apron and bakes pies? And I will tell you, I am a grandma, and I have, for those who are visually impaired, I have teal colored hair, and I don't bake pies. I only wear an apron once in a while. So are we using stereotypes, or are we breaking them? Are we breaking them down and looking at that intersectionality and that blend of different life experiences and moving away from these stereotypes? So that's the sort of psychological background that I did in my research, and how awareness of ability and disability may be the most deep-seated bias. So I'm going to turn it over to Ken to talk about how focusing on disability first can benefit DEI or DEIA initiatives. Ken, you're muted.
Yeah, the internet and COVID and all these teleconferencing technologies. Yes, I was muted. Sorry. So thanks so much, Natalie. That was awesome. I think that really sets the stage in terms of the common sense perspective on why we need this. But if we wanted to look at just the hard, cold facts, that's what I'll be talking about right now. And so apart from metrics like employment numbers, it's really hard to get data showing the success of the DEI program. After all, one of the hardest things to measure are feelings and biases. For instance, a person could hold strongly racist, sexist, or ableist views, yet know how to answer a questionnaire and hide those prejudices. Or worse yet, because many of our biases are so deeply ingrained, and I think that Natalie gave a great example about how these prejudices may be so deeply ingrained around our physical abilities, we may not be even aware that we're discriminated against others. But with accessibility, however, there's a third dimension to the relevant KPIs that's different from just hiring numbers or questionnaire results. And that comes in a number of barriers that a DEIA program can remove. So in the ADA, we've been able to use the ADA standards for accessible design for the last 30 years to pinpoint the exact barriers that people with physical disabilities are likely to encounter. And mostly that's in the built environment. And the W3C's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, create a similar set of standards that organizations can use to identify and remove barriers in the digital world. So in the competitive business world, programs need to meet or exceed their performance metrics and KPIs if they want to survive. By starting with accessibility, DEI programs can score early wins that demonstrates this kind of success. So Both Outlook Business Solutions and Converge Accessibility, which are Natalie's business and my business, focus on web and digital accessibility. And most of our clients use content management systems, or so-called CMSs. And with a few tweaks to the templates and some basic instructions for making content accessible, it's easy for even non-programmers to keep up an accessible website. Plus, these changes are easy to verify and measure. So that means that organizations can pinpoint exactly how improvements are made over time. So for instance, an organization can say things like, well, of the 38 forms that are used on our website, 28 of them were accessible at the end of 2021 Q4. Since then, we've been able to make 5 more accessible, yielding a 17.8% improvement in form accessibility. And in terms of analytics, the new pages had 13,000 visits versus the 18,000 page visits in the original accessible set that we talked about, meaning that there's an overall improvement of almost 42% in terms of daily page views that impact users with disabilities. Now, let's face it, that kind of data is simply impossible to obtain outside of accessibility because barriers in other areas like race and gender don't lend themselves to such objective measurement. So, with societal movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, DEI programs have really become essential in modern organizations. But that doesn't mean that they all automatically succeed. Leadership in organizations support programs that can objectively demonstrate success. And by starting with accessibility, DEI programs can show progress that's quick, measurable, and credible. Oh, and by the way, those same efforts really do improve accessibility and make the organizations more inclusive for people with disabilities. So in short, from a purely logical, cold business perspective, it makes a lot of sense to build accessibility into DEI programs from the very start.
Thanks, Ken. Organizations today talk a great deal about having a diverse and inclusive culture. But the problem with culture is that it can be nebulous and subjective. Because bias is so deeply ingrained in us and is actually part of our brain's natural way of organizing information and placing ourselves in the context of that information, it may never be possible to teach people how to completely eliminate bias in their thoughts. We can, however, teach people how to frame problems in the broadest context for the most diverse audience, whether that audience is employees, customers, or vendors, by starting with disability and accessibility, and then expanding to diverse and underrepresented populations, and then checking for unintentional biases in language and images. One of the other great things about the accessibility approach is that it takes the DEI conversation beyond HR to every area of the company. It affects IT, it affects sales and marketing, it affects procurement and purchasing and contracting. And that is how we will create cultures that highly value and actually exhibit diversity and inclusion rather than just talking about it. With that, we'll open it up to discussion. And we welcome your thoughts and even your challenges to the ideas that we've presented.
Very good. I've been keeping an eye on chat. I haven't seen any questions come through. If anyone wants to, they could also raise their hand. Feel free to come off mute and begin some dialogue. You know, I'll add a little commentary, if that's okay. I think it's interesting how accessibility has and DE&I has shifted with the movements that have been happening lately. It's almost like it's given another wind to accessibility to put it at the forefront. And I love this topic about not just letting that wind lift accessibility, but letting it take it to the beginning of DE&I to say, okay, you know what, let's make this right for everyone from the start. And what a great opportunity to do that. I mean, I think it's kind of like, making the best out of bad situations and using these times to really educate people and companies of ways that they can be more inclusive, which is fantastic. Here's a question that we have. How do you suggest an organization start making the websites accessible? Is there an easy way to do this? Gosh.
And I'll let you take that one.
Sure. Yeah, we do this all the time. I think the first thing that you have to do is you have to get a sense as to where you are. And that involves a manual audit, which is surprisingly limited. You can, even the most complex websites can be reduced down to a set of about 20, 25 web pages that really represent the kind of content that are throughout the entire website and the kind of templates that are throughout the website. Once you are able to understand the accessibility barriers in those representative web pages, then you'll know the kind of barriers that are going to show up everywhere else. And I think that that's the first place to start. And then after that, then it becomes a matter of making sure that your people are trained to avoid those barriers in the future and to avoid creating new barriers in the future. And so that's where other things like, well, to be completely self-serving, we have a product called WebAlign, which Natalie and us are very excited about, which tries to get to this idea of, well, there's this whole other area of type of content that we're thinking about addressing or incorporating. How do we make sure that we don't fall down on our face because we made that completely inaccessible? So that's another way. Those two elements, I believe, are really the key elements towards making a website accessible.
Yeah, I'll add to
okay.
Ken's content about WebAlign. I always liken it to the Incredibles movie and the little snippet at the beginning where they're interviewing the superheroes and Mr. Incredible says, I feel like the maid around here. I just cleaned this place up. Can't we keep it clean for 15 minutes? And that's kind of how accessibility is. Companies will do an audit and then do a round of remediation and then assume that it's just going to stay accessible after that. And we all know that every day new content is getting put on that website. If you don't make accessibility part of the process for the UX designer, for the copywriter, for the graphic designer, for the people writing the code, and for the people doing quality assurance, if everybody doesn't take a step, what you do is you get to the end of that piece of content getting published, and then there's a bunch of rework because the copywriter didn't, take into consideration the language that they used, or we didn't think about the images, or, we scheduled some big event on a date that, was a big holiday for some other religion. So I think building accessibility in helps start that whole checklist process for all types of diversity through the content development instead of like accessibility. It's not just a coder problem.
Absolutely. And to that point, another question came in about what about WebAIM?
Yeah, okay, I'd be happy to take that one on. So WebAIM is a fantastic tool, don't get me wrong. It gives you really great advice on how to do things in accessibility. But what we've decided to do is we were focused really on compliance when we were designing WebAlign. And so what we did was we focused in on what are the things that you have to do if you wanted to succeed with what success criteria 1.3.1, which is, if you're into web accessibility, you'll know is an incredibly vague success criteria. WebAIM doesn't really tell you that. And the other thing that we tried to do was we also tried to make it very role specific. So for instance, if you're designing a wireframe, how do you mark up your wireframe in order to make it accessible? How do you go about testing that? WebAIM is good at telling you the development techniques, which we also do. But then, and I don't mean to make this into a product placement, but that was the question I was asked. And how do you go about testing the design that was ultimately created without having an expert expert knowledge in assistive technology. That's what we were trying to do. So basically, it's for a production environment and an environment that's creating a lot of web content where not everybody is a guru in web accessibility, where they can have a high degree of assurance that they're meeting an incredibly vague success criteria like 1.3.1 or any of the others, or 1.1.1, for instance, or 4.1.2, which is name, role, and value. Things like that are really hard to meet. And what we tried to do was we tried to simplify it and say, okay, what does a wireframe designer have to do? What does a copy author have to do? What does a graphics media author have to do? What does a developer have to do? What does a tester have to do? And without knowing assistive technology. So that's the difference that we have between us and WebAIM. WebAIM, kudos to them. They are fantastic. We look to them all the time for their great resources, but our focus is a little bit different and more focused around requirements as well as role-based. It's more role-based. So.
Great answer. Lloyd says thank you. So it sounds like that answered his question.
Okay.
And then just a comment here about how automated checkers only catch a certain percentage of A11Y issues, and it's after that digital content has been built. So you do want to start the process way before that, and to really incorporate A11Y practices in the design process itself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then here's a question. Are you open to us adopting the quote-unquote checklist from your slides to use in our own work? This person is a college advisor in the Disability Student Services Office at University of Oregon. Welcome. And often offers consultation for instructors on universal design and learning strategies. And your checklist would be great tools to share. Happy to attribute.
Natalie, did we have checklists?
I don't think we had any checklists, although I think the link that's in the chat for the PDF of the slides is the speaker's notes version of the slides. So you'll have all of that information. And there are lots of checklists, but the checklist Ken was referring to are specific to WebAlign.
Oh, right. Okay. I think the question, though, is the checklists from our slides.
Oh, so, sure. Yep. Absolutely. You can use those in terms of like who can use this. Yeah. And that should be in that PDF in the speaker's notes.
Okay.
Those were good. I picked up on that as well. Like, thinking, okay, who can access this information in which kind of ways?
Yeah. And as I was doing the research on this, prepping for tonight, it's night at where I am.
It's night even where we are. Yeah.
In the center of the country. As I was doing the research, it really did start to make more and more sense that if you ask those questions about ability or disability first, then I think it kind of just gets you in the right mindset to think about, well, what are other challenges somebody might have? And those challenges of things like, well, are we assuming that, everybody with a bank account also has a smartphone and can access, that's the way they're going to access their bank account is through an app. Are we making assumptions about everybody's got internet access? We joke about first world problems, but that's kind of what they are. And we need to stop and challenge those things. COVID testing is a really good example. When COVID testing started happening, it was drive-through. All the states were setting up drive-through sites. Well, if you're blind, you cannot drive a car. If you have other types of disabilities, you may not be able to drive a car. So there was a huge lack of understanding of the disability community when the COVID testing was rolled out, because they didn't even think of it. They didn't even stop to think how a person with disabilities would get a COVID test if the only way to get that test was to drive up. So I think it's a good framework to think beyond the basics.
Yeah, Natalie, I have to say that one of the most powerful slides, I think, was that slide that you've got up right now, because it ties in this idea that if you start with accessibility, you naturally create this culture of accessibility throughout an organization, and that just segues into a more inclusive culture throughout in other areas as well. So I'm thinking in particular, my business partner, Jeff Singleton, is going to be presenting, well, is presenting. He has a recorded presentation with Cheryl Pruitt from CSU's Chancellor's Office for this at this PAC RIM, and I encourage you all to look at it, which focuses on how to leverage the procurement process in order to foster accessibility. And I think that might be a really interesting segue into, well, okay, if we're doing that, then how can we incorporate DEI more generally? But accessibility is like the easy entree because of things like Section 508 that are out there. So it's a really interesting discussion, I think. I'm glad we really had this. I'm super glad that we had this.
Yeah, the procurement side is really fascinating to me because one of our sister companies created a product line that is distributed by a minority-owned business, and the products are manufactured by a company that uses predominantly visually impaired labor. And so it kind of marrying of those two things, but Tier 1, Tier 2 spend only looks at the ownership of the company, of the supplier. Mm-hmm. So they look at it as a minority spend, but they're not looking past that to the products or to the employment within that company. They're only looking at who is the owner. And I think that would be another topic. Ken, that's another topic for another conference that we'll have to explore is Tier 1, Tier 2 spend and how that is, especially tokenism in that. But I love the idea of expanding, the accessibility conversation into these other parts of a company outside of HR. I think that's really important.
Yeah, especially since when you're talking about procurement and accessibility, you're talking about the kind of technology you're putting into the infrastructure, which is ultimately going to affect thousands of people. So it's not just a matter of, say, buying from somebody who has a disability. It's a matter of, I buy a product from Microsoft and it's affecting thousands of my customers or my consumers or the people that I'm serving that may have disabilities.
Yes, we see a lot of that with my blind and visually impaired employees, accounting systems. And the toughest one is when you've got a system that works and then they make upgrades or updates to it, and now it doesn't work as well with like screen reader software. So we constantly struggle with finding enterprise software, whether it's a marketing automation tool or it's a content management system or it's a client relationship management system, finding tools that are accessible for our employees who have a disability, ongoing frustration.
I think that one of the things, though, that I'm really fascinated about is if academia could somehow, I guess, get some more, I guess, information or research around this thing that we think is kind of obvious, which is this early built-in ableism that we have. It seems like such a natural thing, because our parents celebrate us for being able to do certain things in our youth. But as we're, toddlers, the first time we take steps, our parents celebrate us, right? And like, oh, you go because you took our first steps. But it will be really interesting to see what research has to say about that, because I got to believe that that's true, that physical abilities is somehow programmed into us at an earlier age.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say my lit review was exhaustive, but I had difficulty finding research that was prior to like preschool. They start doing it in preschool, and because I think then children are able to communicate a little bit more. There's somebody smarter than me probably on this session right now who knows how you would set up some research around disability bias in smaller children. But personal experience with my own child and watching other children react to him even his own niece, my granddaughter, you could tell at an early age that she sensed something different about him, and wasn't sure, why is this person is taller than me. He looks like an adult, but he has behaviors that are more like mine. And so now I'm confused and I don't know how to process that. So we have a lot of explaining in our house about why she is sometimes more articulate than her 26-year-old uncle. So.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for this wonderful information that you've shared today, and for joining, for all of our attendees.